In 476, Romulus Augustulus, emperor of the Western Roman Empire, was forced to abdicate, essentially pressured by the warlord Odovacar. And although there was still another who claimed the title of emperor, Julius Nepos, when Odovacar forced Romulus into retirement and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, as a governing unit, the Western Empire was essentially no more. Several decades later, when Justinian was planning his epic wars of reconquest, they were justified in part by making 476 the official end of the Western Empire. This is a well-known story, and while debate has never stopped among historians and archaeologists for the causes of that fall, any attempt to fully explain it has to grapple with the survival of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. There are a few different ways this can be approached, so what I want to do in this video is examine one of the explanations for its survival, and this is an argument advanced by Brian Ward Perkins in his book The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization. Exactly how destructive the movement of the Germanic peoples deep into the lands of the Roman Empire was is still argued about, but what is certainly known is that there was always this sort of low to medium level pressure on the frontiers, with back and forth raids and attacks by both Romans and Germanic tribes on one another. A major part of what justified the rule of any emperor in the Roman world was the ability of that emperor not only to be able to defend the frontiers and thus prevent enemies from getting into the deep territory, but also to be visibly seen doing so, and then sending word of those victories across the empire. If an emperor did not do that, their legitimacy would be weakened and revolt would be encouraged. Because of this, a major factor in the end of the Western Empire was a preoccupation with internal revolt at the expense of focusing on any barbarian incursion. So in 406, when Roman forces were not able to prevent a crossing of the Rhine by several Germanic groups, with the focus instead being on Alaric and his Goths in Italy, the Emperor Honorius subsequently faced a military challenge to his regime from the north, because he wasn't seen as being able to do one of the primary jobs of an emperor, that is, protecting the frontiers, and on top of that, there was social unrest in Gaul coming in the form of local rebellions. This combination of military challenge, local revolt, and invasion are symptoms of political instability in the West as well as causes of that instability. It eventually becomes this vicious cycle that seriously undermines political control in the Western territories. Ward Perkins notes, however, that the situation in the East was not necessarily any better, and that the cause of what looks like a greater level of stability over a longer period is a combination of luck and geography, which, by his own admission, is extremely unsettling and not something we typically want to acknowledge when trying to explain past events. For about 3 decades, it was the Eastern, not the Western Empire, that was probably weaker both militarily and economically. The Battle of Adrianople, fought in 378, devastated the Eastern Field Army, and it took years to rebuild, during which time not only were the Balkan provinces attacked, but Constantinople itself was threatened. And after 378, the Eastern Empire requested military aid from the Western in 381, 395, and 397, a situation that would only shift once many of the Goths, led by Alaric, crossed to Italy in 401, and the Eastern Field Army was largely rebuilt. On top of this, prior to a shift in foreign policy, the Huns primarily targeted the Eastern Roman territories, not the Western, for plunder and raiding. The Huns were a very different sort of threat, Ward Perkins argues, because unlike the Goths in the 380s and 90s, the Huns were able to lay siege to and successfully take Eastern Roman cities. So, if it's not greater success in the field against enemies, then what explains the survival of the empire in the East? His argument in The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization rests ultimately on 3 factors. The first is long-term peace with the Persian Empire, which was broken in the 5th century only between 421 and 422, and 441 and 442, which enabled Roman forces to direct attention elsewhere. The second is a lack of a serious incursion into the eastern provinces, with the exception of a raid launched over the Caucasus Mountains by the Huns in 395. And lastly, the survival of the Eastern Empire rests upon an accident of geography. The Sea of Marmara, the Bosphorus, and the Dardanelles Straits, which Ward Perkins points out is in some places only 700 meters wide. In some places, you can very easily see the other side of the shore. The major factor that does in the Western Empire is the loss of North Africa to the Vandals in the 420s, which was the last major province that is able to contribute large amounts of tax revenue. 3 attempts to retake it, in 460 by the Western Empire, in 441 and 468 with combined Western and Eastern armies, all fail, with drastic losses of life and thus military manpower. The revenue needed to keep the Western bureaucracy and the military going rapidly began to dry up starting in the 430s, and the state entered a death spiral from which it didn't recover due to a lack of both revenue and the disruptions suffered to the Annona system, which is how Italy got much of its food. The Eastern Empire very well could have suffered a similar fate if hostile armies were able to cross over the straits and take over Anatolia, or worse, Egypt, which was the eastern equivalent of North Africa in terms of a tax and a grain base. They don't, however, because the Germanic peoples who attacked the Eastern Empire, in addition to the Huns, don't seem to have known how to construct ships, and anyone found teaching them to do so was to be killed, as a law in 419 made very clear. While attacks on the Balkan provinces were devastating and very costly, the heartlands of the Eastern Empire were not touched, enabling the state to draw on both money and soldiers, bolstered by a peace with Persia and control of the Eastern Empire's maritime space, ensured that long-term protection. Because this wasn't under threat, Ward Perkins argues, the state avoided any sort of impactful civil war in the 5th century, because it was able to protect the core territory from invasions and raids. The argument is on the one hand simple and on the other perhaps more disturbing than we would like. About this, Ward Perkins writes the following. At one level, because it seems to mock human endeavor as well as historians' attempts to impose order on the past, I am very reluctant to believe that a chance geographical difference is central to explaining the remarkable situation at the end of the 5th century, undreamed of only 100 years earlier. An Eastern Empire, richer and more powerful than ever before, and a Western Empire that had entirely disappeared. However, the evidence is very strong that a thin band of water, reinforced by sea power and supported by peace on other fronts, was the Eastern Empire's greatest defense. Whereas without this advantage, a series of invasions at the start of the 5th century plunged the West into a vicious spiral of devastation, loss of revenue, and bitter strife, from which it never recovered.